Welcome to the last Murphy Institute Center for Ethics and Public Affairs public lecture of the year. Thank you for coming. Since this is the last lecture, I especially want to thank a couple of people. One is our director, Steve Sheffrin. Before he came here, the philosophy department, which takes over a lot of this series, was so concerned that we were going to be dumped by the Murphy Institute that we wrote not one, but 2 letters to the provost saying, are you really going to keep the Ethics Center? And what's this new director going to be like? We are really worried about him. And the provost, I think, who was getting understandably a little irritated, said, no, it'll be fine. He's okay. We know he's an economist. And indeed, Steve has just been superb. He's supported us, and not only that, he's learned a lot of philosophy since being director and been and actually written his most recent book includes some philosophy in it. I don't know how his fellow economists feel about that. But in any case, he's been a wonderful supporter. So thank you, Steve, for all your support. And is Meg in the room? Where are you? I also want to thank Meg Keenan, who is the assistant director, or is that your name title still, or has it changed, of the Center for Ethics and Public Affairs. She is an unbelievable supporter of us and of all of our speakers. She does an exemplary job, and recently she's had a couple of deaths in the family and all kinds of problems. That hasn't stopped her at all. She puts out all of the time for us, so I really want a big round of applause for Meg for all her work this year. Okay, today we have, I think, a very special speaker, Steve Stich. Steve got his doctorate from Princeton in 1968. He has taught at Michigan, Maryland, University of California at San Diego. He is still an honorary professor at University of Sheffield. And I guess you have a hut in the woods over there or something, right? So you have a place over there, correct?
We don't talk about it.
We don't talk about it. He doesn't want any visitors. And he's now at Rutgers University, which, in case you don't know, is one of the absolute best philosophy departments in the country. He is indeed the Board of Governors professor at Rutgers University. So here's our blurb that we circulated, in case you didn't read it. His research interests are in the philosophy of mind, cognitive science, epistemology, and moral psychology. In recent years, he's been involved in projects that explore the extent to which philosophically important intuitions vary from one culture to another. His most recent books, I'll talk about those in a minute. Professor Stich was the first recipient of the APA's, American Philosophical Association, Gittler Award for Outstanding Scholarly Contribution to the Philosophy of the Social Sciences, also the recipient of the Jean Nicod Prize, where he went over and gave a number of lectures, and he is an honorary professor at University of Sheffield, as I just mentioned. But let me tell you a little bit about Steve, because he's been a very influential philosopher for a long time. He started out writing a few things in response to Chomsky and others on innate ideas, and those articles were very famous. And then he joined the Hells Angels of philosophy of mind, that is, the eliminative materialists, wrote a book, even though he told me he isn't living in Manhattan, no longer has a vehicle there, but in any case. And he wrote his first book. Let's see, I don't think I can remember I'm not sure I can remember the title off the top of my head. From Folk Psychology to Cognitive Science, The Case Against Belief. So he said, basically, in one way or another, there weren't any beliefs. And then, being an iconoclast and a member of the Hells Angels of philosophy, went on to be even more that way, and wrote a book called The Fragmentation of Reason, in which he attacked reason, or at least the use and account of reason as it had been held by most philosophers, and especially epistemologists. So he's attacked the mind, and he's attacked reason, and he did this all using a lot of empirical research and really paying attention to what science was saying and not just what philosophers were saying. Indeed, there's a movement in philosophy, which probably only a few of you know about, called experimental philosophy, which involves a lot of actual empirical testing. And Steve is really, in a sense, the person who started that movement before it had a name and so on. He then went on to write Deconstructing the Mind, more of the same, and then wrote a very I can't describe the debate quickly, but there was a big debate about theory of mind, and he, along with Shaun Nichols, wrote a very influential book called Mindreading. More recently, two of his books have just been published in the last few years, which have his collected essays, and you should know that there is a book on him called Stich and His Critics, which gives you a nice overview of the things that he has done and how people have responded to them. And in the last 10 or 15 years or so, he's turned also, in addition to continuing some of his old interests, he's turned also to work on moral psychology and meta-ethics, again, with a very scientific approach, or one that involves a lot of science in addition to some philosophy. And unfortunately, he's no longer that much of an iconoclast because a large part of the philosophy discipline caught up with him, and now I would say about a third to a half of the philosophers operating in the United States spend a whole lot of time reading cognitive science and cultural anthropology and other things like that. And so he's no longer in the Hells Angels. It's too bad because the discipline caught up with him. But in any case, he's been, I think, as is obvious from what I've said, a very influential figure, and we're very happy to welcome him here today.
So I just want to correct one thing that Bruce said about not still being in the Hells Angels. The experimental philosophy movement, which I had a role in launching, has recently been denounced in the pages of no less than the New York Times by an eminent Oxford philosopher who I will not name, who says experimental philosophers, and I quote, hate philosophy. I have been denounced in the pages of the New York Times. Okay, first thing that I should say, actually even before I tell you about the question mark, I'm delighted to see the audience because this is a talk intended to look like that. How many of you are undergraduates? Oh, terrific. This is a talk intended to provide a background of material that I think is enormously important for people who often don't get it in philosophy courses or in related social science courses. All right, so first question to ask is why the question mark? What's that doing here? Well, the answer is, in some sense, you're here under false pretenses. I'm not going to talk about the evolution of morality at all. What I am going to talk about is the evolution of norms of the sort that Chandra Sripata and I talked about in a paper called Framework for the Psychology of Norms, and the psychological mechanisms that underlie those norms. And it's far from clear that what I'll sometimes call SNS, or Sripata-Stich norms, it's far from clear that the class of Sripata-Stich norms is identical with the class of moral norms. Indeed, it's far from clear that there is any, I'm told I should bend that back, there is any such thing as the class of moral norms. I'm skeptical that there is any well-defined and well-motivated account of moral norms at all. But that's the topic for another talk, which I happen to have on my hard drive if you want to stay for a while. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about norm psychology as Sripata and I conceive of it, and then plunge into the evolutionary story. In the framework paper, Sripata and I characterize a model of norm psychology that looks like this. There'll be a quiz. More recently, I have developed the model, so it's gotten increasingly more complicated. It now looks like this. I'm going to focus on the early model, but most of the details are going to be irrelevant, so you don't have to worry about everything that's going on in there. The Sripata-Stich theory posits two closely linked innate mechanisms. There's one responsible for norm acquisition, and another one responsible for norm implementation. The functions of the acquisition mechanism are several. They include identifying behavioral cues that indicate that a norm prevails in the local environment, inferring the content of that norm, passing the information on to the implementation system where it is stored and used. The acquisition system on our account begins to operate quite early in development, and its operation is automatic and involuntary. You don't need to turn it on, and you can't turn it off. It may turn itself off sometime after adolescence, but the empirical story is still far from clear on that. The implementation mechanism's functions include maintaining that database of normative rules acquired by the acquisition mechanism, generating intrinsic motivation to comply with those rules, detecting violations of the rules, and generating intrinsic motivation to punish the rules. So that's basically the story you need about the Sropotter-Stich theory. It's important to note that the theory claims that a cluster of mechanisms are innate. It does not claim that the information stored in the norm database is innate. There may indeed be some innate elements in there or innate constraints on the sorts of information that can be stored in the norm database, but the nature of those constraints is still very much an open and actively researched question. All right, well, in the original paper, Sropotter and I argue that the model is compatible with a wide range of findings in psychology, in neuroscience, in anthropology, and in experimental economics. I'm inclined to think that the updated model is compatible with a fair amount of the enormously rich empirical literature on moral psychology that has emerged since that paper was published 5 or 6 years ago. Okay? But there are, of course, lots of other accounts of norm psychology or moral norm psychology in the literature. So why am I focusing on our particular idiosyncratic account? The answer is most of the details of the Sropotter-Stich theory aren't going to be important. The details that I'm going to focus on are in fact shared by many, although of course not all, but many of the alternative accounts of norm psychology to be found in the literature. So really what I'm doing is focusing on a category of theories of norm psychology that are in important ways similar to the one that Sropotter and I put forward. All right, so that's the norm psychology story. Next question to ask is, I guess the next question to ask is one of these open? There we go. Why should we care about the evolution of norm psychology? Well, I'm going to give you two very different kinds of reasons. First of all, the Sropotter-Stich model that I've sketched for you, along with a wide family of similar models, so it's not just us who have this issue, entails that people can sometimes acquire norms that lead them to engage in behaviors that lower their biological fitness, indeed in some cases dramatically lower their biological fitness, by having few or no children, by sacrificing themselves in national or tribal warfare, by refusing to eat nutritious foods, by using techniques of body decoration that can cause major health problems like our friend up here, and in lots and lots of other ways. So it might be thought that given the story that we've put forward about norm psychology, natural selection couldn't produce that psychological mechanism that leads people to behave in ways that reduce their fitness. I think that's an important challenge, and I think it's one that needs to be met and can be met in an interesting way. But that's one of the reasons to be concerned with how norm psychology evolved. It's to answer that challenge. Second reason is that many accounts of the evolution of complex systems either entail or, much more typically, suggest claims about the properties that such systems are likely to have. Among the properties that we'd expect to find in systems with an evolutionary history like the one I'm going to sketch for you are some properties that are pretty philosophically interesting, and those are the properties I'm going to talk about in the last few minutes of the talk. All right, so that's where I'm going. Let me get started. The first step, and this is really, in some sense, I think, for a lot of you, maybe the most valuable part of the talk, I want to lay down some foundations, some things I'm going to assume about the mind and justify them, which are going to be the foundations then of telling you a story about the evolution of norm psychology. What I want to talk about is some psychological mechanisms and processes that I maintain were in place when norm psychology began to emerge. They're the foundations of my evolutionary story. And there can be little doubt, indeed no doubt at all, that the precursors I'm going to talk about are important features in the psychology of contemporary humans. So really all I have to assume here is that the evolution of these precursors was well underway when norm psychology began to evolve. All right, well, the crucial story I have to tell you then is about social learning. All organisms learn, but humans are unique in the magnitude of what they learn from each other. To an extent that's completely unprecedented in other species, we acquire beliefs, skills, desires, preferences, emotional elicitors, and other information-rich mental states that are similar in content to the mental states of the people around us. And the contents of the mentors, the person we're acquiring it from, the contents of the mentor's mental state plays a central role in this process. I'm going to call, following the literature here, I'm going to use the term social learning for any process in which information in one organism's mind plays an important causal role in getting similar information into some other organism's mind. And since I find that drawings and cartoons are often the way to fix ideas very clearly, here's all you have to remember about social learning. That's what social learning is, okay? Something in one mind getting more or less accurately transferred into another mind, where the content of that is important in determining the content of that. Well, humans aren't the only species in which social learning occurs. It's been found in a wide variety of other species, ranging from songbirds to guppies. But social learning in humans occurs at a vastly greater scale. We acquire far more information and far more varied information than any other species. And we're far more reliant on that information. Indeed, without social learning, most humans could not survive very long. Boyd and Richardson, who are two of the gurus of social learning, and from Boyd and Richardson and from their students I've learned an enormous amount over the last decade, they propose a sort of cute thought experiment to make the point about how important social learning is for humans. Imagine a modern urban professional who is parachuted into the Sonoran Desert, where people have lived for centuries. As they point out, that is how he would end up almost certainly and very quickly. Why? Well, because he doesn't have the socially learned information that peoples who have lived in those desert climates have acquired. Okay? So following Boyd and Richardson, I'm going to use the term, and this is stipulation, by the way, if you don't, I don't claim this is the right way to use the term or anything of the sort, but one way it's used in the literature, and I'm going to stipulate, I'm going to use the word culture for information that's transmitted and transformed via social learning. Well, you might ask, why do humans have such an extraordinary capacity for social learning? That's a great question, but to answer it would require yet another talk. And as I say, I've got a lot of stuff on my hard drive, so the longer you want to stay, the better as far as I'm concerned. But I won't try to give it to you today. I do want to give you a brief hint that the emergence of language, I think, clearly played an important part. And the emergence of what's sometimes called mind reading, that is to say, the capacity to attribute mental states to other organisms, to typically other humans. Language and mind reading played an important part in that process. Well, as should be obvious, social learning, as I've just characterized it, underlies an inheritance system via which traits like beliefs, skills, preferences, and emotional elicitors can be passed from one individual to another. And in the literature, the term dual inheritance theory is widely used to label the study of the interaction between these two somewhat similar but importantly different inheritance systems, the social learning system on the one hand, and the more familiar biological inheritance system on the other. Well, though those two systems share many properties, there are some important differences that I want to focus in on. First of all, social learning is Lamarckian. It allows the transmission of newly acquired traits. In humans, those traits are often acquired via trial and error learning, or other sorts of inductive learning, or deductive inference. So you learn something new, you can pass it on to your offspring or to other humans via social learning. Information encoded in your genes. Well, let me start that sentence again. If you acquire a new physical trait, that can't be passed along to your progeny or anyone else. In humans, and this is crucially important, social learning is also cumulative. New information can both modify and add to previously existing information. For aficionados here, they'll all know that the most famous example is the one Rob Boyd likes to talk about, the history of kayak building, where innovations that accumulated over centuries led to a rich body of knowledge and skills that enables Inuit and Aleut peoples and others to construct these elegant, sophisticated sealskin vessels. So one of the points that Boyd likes to make is, how long would you survive if you were dropped into the Arctic? Answer, not very long. Why do the Inuits and the Aleuts succeed? Answer, in part, because via social learning, they've acquired the techniques for building things that enable them to hunt on the open water. All right, well, because human social transmission is Lamarckian and cumulative, it's enabled humans to adapt to new and changing environments much more quickly than would be possible if we had to rely only on gene-based information transmission and on individual inductive learning strategies whose fruits couldn't be passed on to others. Indeed, I think this is the core to why humans have dominated the planet. It's because we're capable of cumulative social learning. Another important difference that's going to play a big role in my story between gene-based inheritance and the cultural inheritance system is that genetic inheritance is always vertical, from parent to offspring. While social transmission can, of course, be vertical, parent to offspring, but it could also be horizontal, one adult to another, or one child to another, or oblique, an adult to a child to an adult. All of those are possible. And since culturally transmitted information can come from a variety of sources, there'll be lots of people to learn from, lots of potential mentors. And these people will, at least sometimes, have different beliefs, skills, preferences, and emotional elicitors. So a social learner has to have some strategy to determine who to learn from. If you've got lots of people to learn from, who do you decide to learn from? In the literature here, two families of strategies have been distinguished and studied using sophisticated mathematical models. Boyd and Richardson like to call them content biases and context biases. I think these are terrible terms, but I'm going to use them because they're sort of embedded in the literature. Bias here should simply be read as strategy. There's nothing, it's not a bias like racial bias is a bias. It's a strategy for how you acquire, how you decide which information to acquire. Let me say a tiny little bit about content biases. Context biases are going to play a much more important role in the story. Content biases rely on some feature of the packet of information. So what you're doing is deciding which packet of information should you acquire, should you take on board. Content biases rely on some feature of that packet of information, which makes it more appealing, easier to learn, more easily remembered, and so on. So for example, a nice intuitive example, if you're confronted with two ways of preparing a type of food, a social learner may just pick the one that tastes better, that is more appealing. If the tastes are equally appealing, he may opt for the one that requires the least effort. Context biases are another story. They rely on the fact that there's often a great deal of adaptively important information to be gleaned by attending to the features of individuals from whom the information is acquired, and by attending to how common various options are in the surrounding population. By looking at those two things, features of the individuals and how common they are, you can learn quite a lot about the quality of the information you're going to get. For example, if an individual is highly successful and well-respected, it may be a good bet to use that individual as a model rather than learning from a low-status individual or trying to evaluate the options on your own. Boyd and Richardson talk about that, label that the prestige bias. Under other circumstances, it may be a better bet to rely on a conformity bias and opt for the alternative that's most common in the surrounding community. Now, on these topics, there's been a great deal of very sophisticated mathematical modeling done, which is devoted to exploring the properties of these biases and the conditions under which they'll lead to adaptive choices among the alternative packets of information. That literature is very sophisticated and requires a fair amount of fancy mathematics, but there's one result that's both really important for our purposes and entirely intuitive, and that's this, that even in situations in which the choices made are in accordance with one of the, sorry, let me start that sentence again. Even in situations in which choices made in accordance with one of the context biases are clearly the best bet, right? So it's the best bet to use one of these context biases. A specific choice made in that way can misfire badly and lead to seriously maladaptive consequences. For example, in a situation where the prestige bias is most likely to lead to an adaptive choice, a social learner has to determine how much, so you got a prestigious guy, how much of the successful model practices and preferences and beliefs should you take on board. Often it will be difficult or impossible to determine how much of that package actually contributes to the model's success. What is contributing and what isn't contributing is typically very far from obvious. So here's an example. Suppose the social learner is acquiring a package of information relevant to hunting. How should he react to the prayers and rituals of a successful hunter? The way the successful hunter decorates his body, or the way he deals with his children. Any of these might be relevant to the model's success. Confronted with that problem, a social learner would often be wise to adopt as many of the salient features of the model that he can, including causally inefficacious rituals, idiosyncratic patterns of body decoration, and maladaptive patterns of parental behavior. And if there's a single successful and prestigious figure in a given group, his or her idiosyncrasies, false beliefs, and inefficacious practices may become quite common. And when they do, the conformity bias might help to stabilize them and make them hard to dislodge. Well, Boyd and Richardson, in some of their more recent work, have used the term rogue meme for packets of socially learned information of this sort. That is to say, packets of information which actually decrease the fitness of people who adopt those packets, even though in the long run, the biases that lead to their adoption often offer the best bet for acquiring adaptive information. Okay. So, with the dramatic increase of social learning after the emergence of language and mind reading, the environment in which gene-based natural selection occurred changed in an important way. And this, in turn, had an effect on the sorts of genes that spread via natural selection. So this is the phenomenon of gene-culture coevolution, where what I'm focusing on here is the way in which cultural change changes the environment in which genetic natural selection takes place. The parade case that everybody, yes, that's what I just said. The parade case for this, far from our current concern, but just to illustrate it beautifully, and there's a wonderful, rich literature, here is the spread of adult lactase production in human populations. It spread in those populations that had the culturally transmitted skill of herding large animals. So the obvious story here is you learn to herd large animals, then you've got milk that you can feed to adolescents and adults. Then it becomes adaptively useful to be able to process lactase as an adolescent or an adult, and a gene that enables you to do that spreads throughout the population. The story is somewhat more complicated, but the predictions are just amazingly accurate, that the fit between theory and data about where lactose tolerance and intolerance exists is really very impressive. Well, getting back to what we were talking about before, as more adaptively useful, culturally transmitted information becomes available, we should expect the evolution of increasingly efficient and accurate psychological processes for extracting that information, and processes that facilitate the use of adaptively appropriate selection biases. Again, very simple idea, right? If there's adaptively useful information out there in the environment, then it becomes a good thing if you have psychological capacities to extract that information and psychological capacities to figure out from whom you ought to extract that information, who you ought to take as a model. All right. Well, that's my foundation. So what I want to do now, remember my goal is to give an account of the evolution of norm psychology. And my foundation is going to be the story I just told you about social learning. I'm going to assume that prior to the evolution of norm psychology, humans had evolved a prodigious capacity for social learning that enabled them to acquire a variety of information-rich mental states from other people, including beliefs, desires and preferences, skills, and emotion elicitors. Once social learning was in place, it was all but inevitable that some communities would acquire what I'll call proto norms. A proto norm is simply a culturally transmitted, that is to say, a socially learned package of psychological states that includes a desire to engage in a certain sort of behavior under specified circumstances, a desire that other people do the same, and an emotional elicitor that leads to an agonistic emotion, typically either anger or disgust, when one becomes aware that another person isn't behaving in the desired way. So I want to do it this way, I want you to do it this way too, and I get pissed off at you if you don't. That's all a proto-norm is. And of course, those agonistic emotions can and sometimes do lead to punitive behavior directed at the people who don't behave in the desired way. Since this is the first time punitive has appeared, at least in this context in the talk, let me say that it has to be, of course, interpreted broadly. One way to exhibit punitive behavior to Radu would be to punch him in the nose. But spreading rumors about him, indicating to my daughters that they can't marry his sons, all of these are perfectly punitive behaviors, right? It can be, but it doesn't have to be hitting him or killing him. Okay, so keep that in mind when we talk about punitive behaviors. All right, so in many respects, people with proto-norms are going to resemble people with the full-fledged norm psychology that Sropada and I described, with a description of the desired behavior in the norm base. So they'll be motivated to comply. They'll be motivated to comply. They'll be motivated to feel agonistic emotions when others don't comply. They'll be motivated to punish non-compliance. So in these respects, they'll behave very similar to someone who actually has that full norm psychology. Well, now you might ask, well, how does a proto-norm arise and become common in a group? The answer is there are lots and lots and lots of ways. Here's an example. A high-prestige individual might come to prefer that he and others behave in some specified way in a cooperative enterprise, like hunting or house building, and get angry when they don't. Prestige bias might lead others to acquire his preferences and emotion elicitors. And as the proto-norm becomes more common, it might spread further via conformity bias. A completely similar story can be told, this is sort of left to the listener, a completely similar story can be told about proto-norm food taboos and how they might arise and become widespread in a population. As Henrik and Henrik note, all kinds of effects can make a phenomenon like a proto-norm or a cooperative behavior common at a particular place and a particular time. The real challenge is to explain why these proto-norms won't simply vanish back into evolutionary history as the system returns to equilibrium. And the answer to that, or at least one answer, the first answer to that, there are now several competing answers, or not necessarily competing, they may all be true, but the first important answer to that was provided in a seminal paper by Boyd and Richardson in 1992 with the suggestive title that punishment allows the evolution of cooperation or anything else in sizable groups. And here's a very quick overview of what goes on in that paper. In the years prior to the publication of the paper, it had become clear that the sorts of reciprocity-based accounts that have been proposed for cooperative behavior between pairs of individuals, although impressive in their way, they just wouldn't scale up. They're fragile. So in exploring formal models for alternative accounts, Boyd and Richardson made a pair of crucial discoveries. The first discovery, which is hardly surprising, is that cooperative behavior that's costly to the individual engaging in the behavior, but beneficial to others, can in fact be sustained even in large groups by a combination of prestige and conformity bias if non-cooperators are punished. The second result, which is somewhat more surprising, is this result is not restricted to cooperative patterns of behavior in which costs are incurred by one person that benefit other members of the group. Punishment, provided that it's not too costly on those who inflict it, and remember things like gossiping about other people can be a very effective form of punishment, damaging their reputation, and it's relatively cheap. Still some danger to gossip, but relatively cheap. So punishment that's not too costly on those who inflict it will stabilize patterns of behavior that literally benefit nobody. It'll even stabilize patterns of behavior that harm everybody. That's the key insight to understanding how proto-norms can become stable in a population. Once they arise and become widespread, proto-norms are self-perpetuating, combining a desire for a kind of behavior with an agonistic emotion, anger, disgust, and so on, triggered by the behavior, or triggered by behavior that doesn't comply with the desire, leads often enough to punishment of noncompliance, and punishment stabilizes proto-norms. So, enter norm psychology. Since proto-norms are stable and self-perpetuating, ancestral populations came to have more and more of them, and that, again, led to an important change in the environment in which gene-based natural selection operated. For the more proto-norms there are in the environment, the more important it is that people be able to detect them and acquire them quickly and accurately. If you're in an environment that's just sort of saturated with, or at least that has a significant number of proto-norms in your culture, then you are a lot better off if you can detect them quickly and take them on board. Why? Well, obviously, because people who do a bad job of that are less likely to behave in the way required by the proto norm and more likely to get punished. So psychological mechanisms like those posited by Sripada and me, and remember, the details here really aren't crucial. Lots of different stories that have these features could be explained in the same way. But psychological mechanisms like those posited by Sripada and me are just what's needed to avoid punishment and increase fitness in an environment that's increasingly permeated by proto norms. So I maintain, in the new niche created by the spread of proto norms, genes that foster a Sripada-Stich style norm psychology become increasingly adaptive. That's the story about the evolution of norm psychology. So the norm psychology is the product of the new selective pressures generated by the spread of proto norms. All right, so there's my evolutionary story. If I were concerned only about your intellectual well-being, I could stop here. But I want to tell you some more fun stuff because I think the story gets much more interesting than merely how did norm psychology evolve. It's a startling implication of the Boyd and Richardson 1992 paper that punishment can stabilize just about any sort of behavior. So enduring proto-norms can require behavior that benefits no one or prohibit behavior that benefits everybody. That's a sort of strange result. And the same is true, of course, for real norms that replaced proto-norms as norm psychology spread. Real norms are just the sorts of norms embedded in a psychology like the one I've described. Okay? But while norms that can require behavior that's pointless or maladaptive, norms can require behavior that's pointless or maladaptive, they also, of course, can require behavior that's beneficial to other individuals or to the group as a whole. And over time, we should expect these group beneficial norms to become more common. Why? Well, because groups compete with one another. And groups whose norms enable them to defend themselves more effectively, wage war more successfully, raise more food, create more wealth, have more and healthier children, will gradually, or of course sometimes not so gradually, particularly in the war domain, gradually or not so gradually replace groups that do some of these things less well. But, you say, gasp, isn't that group selection? And don't we know group selection is bad? The answer is, yes, it is group selection, but it's cultural group selection. It's not genetic or biological group selection. And for reasons I'll be happy to talk about in the discussion period, cultural group selection is much less problematic an idea than genetic group selection. Okay, so I've told you that there should be a general inclination for pro-social or group beneficial norms, but we should not expect that all norms will be group beneficial. And there are a number of reasons for this. I think I'm going to mention three. I have 5 or 6, but we only have time for 3. First of all, new norms can arise and spread via prestige and conformity bias faster than cultural group selection can cull those that are not group beneficial. So the two processes work at different speeds. So other things being equal, the newer the norm, the less likely it is to be group beneficial. Remember, this is other things being equal, and it's supposed to be a statistical generalization. By the way, this is the one new empirical prediction of this theory. I have no evidence that it's true or not, but the theory does seem to suggest that the newer the norm, other things being equal, the less likely it is to be group beneficial. Second, punishment makes all of a group's norms difficult to dislodge. In a successful group with many group beneficial norms, the non-group beneficial norms that it has will be transmitted and stabilized in the same way that the group beneficial norms are. So that will protect maladaptive food taboos, costly but inefficacious rituals, dangerous body decorations, and other non-group beneficial norms that happen to be entrenched in successful groups. Third reason is that some non-group beneficial norms may be transformed into ethnic boundary markers. That's a fascinating story, and I think I'm going to have time to tell you that in a few minutes. It's also important to recognize, so I've given you 3 reasons why not all norms will be group beneficial. Actually, I've given you 2 and promised you a third. It's also important to recognize that not all group beneficial norms, remember, group beneficial norm is just a norm that leads to the survival and spreading of that group. Okay? Not all group beneficial norms require behavior that help other people, and not all behavior required by group beneficial norms will be morally admirable by contemporary Western standards. I gave a version of this talk in Seoul, South Korea 2 weeks ago. I had to say something else over there. Okay, so for example, in many situations, norms that require men to kill the men in enemy groups and enslave their women will foster survival and growth of the group. That is to say, those norms will be group beneficial. Also, there are many ways in which norms and the behavior they encourage can lead to group survival and success. Norms can do this in a variety of different ways, and sometimes different norms that would both lead to group survival and success will be incompatible with each other. So even after an extended period of cultural group selection, we should expect to find a distribution within a culture. If you have a randomly selected culture, what would we expect even after an extended period of cultural group selection? I submit a distribution of norms within a culture that looks like this. Some group beneficial, some not group beneficial, and maybe some of each that are consistent with contemporary Western morality. And a distribution of across cultures. If you get a randomly selected set of cultures, the distribution is going to look something like that. All right, 2 more short sections to go, and then I'm done. So I promised you something on ethnic boundary markers, and the theme here is that ethnic boundary markers can make quirky and maladaptive norms group beneficial. So in a world inhabited by lots of groups with significantly different norms, it's important to be able to recognize members of one's own group. Why? Well, they share one's norms, and therefore they behave in predictable ways. And it's easier to engage in cooperative ventures with them. People in other groups expect different behavior and are inclined to punish behavior that is, common or required in one's own group. So important to be able to recognize people in your own group, people who share your norms. How can you recognize members of other groups? Well, here's an obvious idea, but a wrong one. Racial indicators. You might think things like skin color or facial features or hair texture and so on might be good indicators of who's in your group. But for most of human history, people rarely encountered people with different skin color or racial features. After all, you have to travel a significant distance to encounter those people, typically. And hunter-gatherers didn't travel significant distances frequently. Okay? A much better solution is to focus on conspicuous, norm-governed behavior or its consequences. Like what? Well, they eat snake. We have a taboo against eating snake and find the idea disgusting. You probably can't read this menu from a snake restaurant. Blood wine, venom wine, snakeheads wine, snake gallbladder wine. I'll be happy to put the slide up later for those who would like to study it. And there's a gentleman preparing the main course. Our women cover their faces. Their women don't. Our men pierce their noses with bone jewelry and do not tattoo their faces. Their men do the opposite. these cues are going to be highly correlated, at least typically, are going to be highly correlated with other norms, including norms governing cooperative behavior. And many of them, for obvious reasons, think of my friend with the pierced nose, many of them are very, very hard to fake. Okay? In a norm-permeated environment in which it's important to quickly and accurately assess whether a person shares one's norms, such an environment creates a new selection pressure on genetic evolution. Genes that help build psychological mechanisms that are sensitive to group membership cues and that incline people to prefer interacting with people from their own group. And the other side, of course, is dislike interacting with people in other groups, are going to be favored by natural selection. Well, once these psychological mechanisms are in place, notice what happens. Quirky local norms that lead to conspicuous, hard-to-fake behavior become adaptive for the individual and beneficial to the group. For the individual, they're just reliable ways of advertising, reliable ways of saying, I'm a member of your group and can be expected to behave in accordance with the group's norms. For the group, quirky local norms make it easy to distinguish members from outsiders, even when that person is a stranger. They thus provide, I think, an important part of the story about what makes it possible for human groups to grow larger and more powerful, what makes it possible to get beyond band level to large tribal communities. So, in an environment in which psychological mechanisms sensitive to cues of group membership are widespread, quirky local norms that require pointless, costly, or dangerous behavior may actually be favored by cultural group selection. They become group beneficial norms. That's sort of cute. You want to see it again there? All right, almost done. Philosophical implications, just to provoke my philosophy colleagues. If this account of the evolution of norm psychology is even close to correct, we should expect that different groups will have significantly different norms. When members of different groups have different norms governing the same activity, their disagreement is going to be particularly intractable. Suppose, for example, that Group A's norms require that women dress with extreme modesty, and Group B's norms require only minimal modesty. Facts about the consequences of modest or immodest dress, or about the consequences of imposing special restrictions on women, are unlikely to sway people on either side. Since the mechanism subserving the conviction that immodest dress is wrong and should be punished, or the conviction that it's not wrong and should not be punished, they weren't designed to take account of facts of this sort. The mechanisms were designed to locate and internalize locally prevailing norms and to motivate compliance with those norms. So we'd expect mechanisms to be very sensitive to information indicating what norms really do prevail locally. But we wouldn't expect the system to be sensitive to facts about the consequences of obeying or violating the norms, except, of course, for facts about how likely it is that norm-violating behavior really will be punished and how severe the punishment will be. The mechanism was also designed to be sensitive to information indicating whether or not a particular norm was indeed violated. So, if there's a prevailing norm that prohibits men from having sex with their mother, the system should be sensitive to information relevant to how Oedipus and Jocasta are related when deciding whether Oedipus should be punished. But information about the likelihood of incestuous sex producing children with birth defects, or about the social or psychological consequences of allowing incestuous sex, is just not the sort of information the system was designed to care about. So people who have internalized norms about incest or modest dress might agree on a wide swath of factual claims, and none, including lots of prima facie relevant factual claims, and nonetheless continue to disagree about whether specific cases of incest or immodest dress are unacceptable and should be punished. Okay, well, evolutionary design arguments of the sort I've just been setting out for you are almost always far from conclusive, and certainly this one is far from conclusive. But I think that if the evolutionary account I've given is even roughly correct, it adds additional support to a kind of claim I've tried to defend elsewhere using more direct psychological evidence about the persistence of moral disagreement. In particular, the claim that eliminating factual disagreement will often not eliminate moral disagreement. Moral disagreement is often deeply entrenched because of the kind of mechanism that underlies it and its evolutionary reasons for existing. All right, I want to thank Joe Henrich, who did a lot of getting information into my head, and now we're done.